Hello, everyone, and welcome back to AHGP. My name is Aaron Harper. I am your host, and today's episode has a very special guest. I've got Ruby Price on with me, and we are discussing Ferrari and Mercedes and their chances of mounting a challenge to Red Bull in 2023. We're going to cover Helmut Marko's statement on Mercedes being the stronger overall package, and Carlos Sainz's claim that Ferrari aren't really that far away, and lots more besides. Now, before editor Aaron puts on the conversation, a little heads up that my audio wasn't always perfect for reasons unknown, and at times I sound a bit like a robot, but hopefully we can all move past that and we can enjoy the conversation plenty still. Alright then, this is my discussion with Ruby about Red Bull's biggest threat in 2023. Red Bull and Max Verstappen ruthlessly crushed the field in 2022 despite Ferrari and Charles Leclerc winning 2 of the opening 3 races. Will 2023 see another runaway Max Verstappen title triumph, or can Ferrari and Mercedes provide opposition to the Dutchman's charge? With me to discuss who will be the biggest threat to Red Bull and Verstappen's dominance this season is Ruby Price. Good evening, Ruby. How are you?
Good evening. Happy to be here. Debut on 5 Red Lights. Very happy.
Great to have you here. Now, it is no longer called the 5 Red Lights.
Is it not?
No, we are now AHGP. So if you want to find out more about that, you can go back to my last video and check out some of the reasons for that. So that is actually a really good pointer for everybody. Ruby, that is very, very useful. Now, what do you do outside of your daily life, Ruby, and where do you fit into the motorsport world?
Well, in terms of the motorsport world, very much in Formula One, as you know, you can kind of tell if you've ever seen anything that I've been involved in. I am one of the main hosts of the Formula One Chronicles Grid Talk podcast. We do shows basically after every qualifying and race result, and we do previews, and we also do interviews and sort of like more relaxed style episodes with a few other of the hosts, but primarily, you know, we're right there as soon as a race is over, delivering analytical content straight to your eyes and ears.
Brilliant. Now, I'm a guest on F1 Chronicles Grid Talk podcast from time to time. It's a great bunch of hosts and panelists. We have people literally from all over the world come on, which is brilliant. So I love being a part of it. If you haven't gone and give it a listen, make sure you do, because we'll have, I think George worked it out last week. It was like 69 episodes just for the races, and then we've got all sorts of other stuff coming around that. So there's going to be plenty for you to feast your eyes and ears on. Now, hopefully, there'll be plenty for us to feast our eyes and ears on the track this year. Ruby, are we going to finally get that 3-way battle at the front we've been longing to see for so many years? Is it finally going to be Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes all locking horns?
Well, we did kind of see glimpses of it, you know, in 2022 at places like Silverstone and COTA, for example. But it was kind of more because someone either dropped the ball or something happened during those races that put us in the position of having that fight. What would actually be kind of hilarious is if, you know, the top 3 wasn't Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes. But I do think, you know, we had a complete regulation overhaul for 2022. Teams will be a bit more, you know, confident in the cars that they're running for 2023. Hopefully, you know, they will all be within the regulations so that, you know, you don't have one car steaming ahead, but also hopefully, you know, teams have caught up with, you know, the absolute powerhouse that was Red Bull in 2022.
Yeah, we definitely had a glimpse at what could be at Silverstone and at COTA. And there were different points of the season where it was either Mercedes or it was Ferrari who were closest to Red Bull, but ultimately neither of them able to really put in a sustained challenge. Mercedes for the reason that they were the team who dropped the ball, and Ferrari because their strategy was wrong, or the car imploded, or Charles Leclerc, bless him, was throwing it in the barrier at Paul Ricard. Now, Helmut Marko, the motorsport boss at Red Bull, has spoken about Mercedes being the biggest challenger in 2023. And this is what he said before Christmas. It was published on Race, I think, Motorsport Week. That's the one I found it on. He said, Ferrari is strong, but Mercedes will be stronger in the overall package, especially with a driver like Lewis Hamilton. He's still a top driver. Ferrari also has a very good driver in Leclerc. He still makes mistakes. Is Marco right to fear Mercedes above Ferrari?
Well, when you look at the 2022 season, Mercedes are the team out of the two that have momentum. You know, you look at where they were in preseason testing and when they actually revealed the car that they would be racing with in 2022, because, you know, the first iteration isn't really counted. But, you know, you look at where they were nowhere near the front of the pack. They still actually managed to look into podiums, which was incredible. But, you know, by the time we hit COTA and especially Brazil, you know, they had a car that was very much in the mix. Whereas, like, you know, you look at Ferrari, whose last win was Austria, which was back in July. Once that happened and once, you know, there was the big old no in France, Ferrari just couldn't put a race win together, no matter how quick they were on their one lap pace. But yeah, you know, Mercedes have proven time and time again, they are the masters of strategy. Well, 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, they were effective as a race team in 2022, which was always good to see, because that was something that was long held against them, actually, because of the dominance they had in especially the early years of the hybrid era with Hamilton and Rosberg, where they were just so far ahead that, you know, they could take 5 seconds to do a pit stop, and it made absolutely no difference. It was kind of embarrassing for everybody else. But to see them so race sharp with their strategies last year, and to be fair, when you've got a car that's not got the performance, you have to be really strategy savvy. And we saw Red Bull do it all those years when they weren't quite fighting at the front. They were the third car in the battle. And I think it's really quite interesting that Marco actually names Lewis Hamilton, because, of course, he's Lewis Hamilton. He's won 7 world championships, 100+ races, more than 100 pole positions. He's got almost every record there is to have in Formula One. I think that's significant. Do you think that's going to play to Hamilton? Well, I say Hamilton's strength, but is that going to disadvantage perhaps Max Verstappen, because Helmut Marko is constantly looking at Lewis, and obviously Max and Lewis keep having these tangles on the track, and we saw that in Brazil. Do you think that's going to have any sort of effect on Max's sort of considerations? Because he's actually said last week in an interview with Autosport, he doesn't understand why he keeps crashing with Lewis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's going to affect Max in the way that a lot of people might think it would. You know, Max very much outwardly, at least, seems to almost have an air of nonchalance. You know, there's very little that does seem to faze him, but you are right. And he is also right in acknowledging it's always Lewis Hamilton. And you look at, you know, the way that he races, or the drivers and other drivers race him, you know, Lewis has the contentious title of GOAT for, because he ties with Michael Schumacher of being, you know, 7-time world champion. Max has to race Lewis differently, because Lewis Hamilton is a driver that doesn't give, you know, space. Lewis Hamilton is a driver that very much, you know, will fight until he has no chance left. You know, look at Silverstone in 2021. I think it was 10-second time penalty or 5-second time penalty. You know, damaged car, comes home to win the race with about 2 laps remaining and breaking all of Ferrari's hearts. Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure that Marco's comments would affect Max, but it is also, you know, interesting that Marco does consider Lewis to be, you know, still up there, because those weren't the kind of comments we were getting during the season.
No, you're never quite sure what you're going to get from Helmut Marko, and I suppose this is one of the more sensible lines he's taken, because we've seen him come out with the odd questionable quote or two. And I think it's really significant that he sees Mercedes as the big threat, because obviously they've been toe-to-toe with Mercedes. They kind of know what they're going to get, but they've got something of an unknown quantity adversarially in George Russell. We had a bit of Max versus George this year in Spain, or last year even, in Spain and at Sao Paulo, where George passed Verstappen to win the sprint and then went on to win his first Grand Prix. And now I've been thinking about how the two Mercedes drivers might almost get in each other's way. Is George going to be potentially the guy to take on Red Bull?
I certainly think he has the capability of. He is still developing as a driver, you know, as I think all drivers should be. You know, once a driver starts to settle in and be, you know, oh, I don't need to push anymore. That's how you get Kimi Räikkönen at Alfa Romeo, where he doesn't care. But you know,
Did
George
Kimi
is
ever
very
care?
possibly. I think maybe before he went off on his sabbatical for a few years, but
maybe when he was on the boat in Monaco.
maybe. But yeah, George is the driver that's, you know, only been in that Mercedes for one season, and the season that he got wasn't, you know, he won a race and he won the sprint, but ultimately, and he also got a pole as well. But you know, it wasn't the Mercedes that he would have been expecting, you know, when he's been driving around in a Williams, seeing Lewis win race after race and Valtteri Bottas win race is, you know, but I think George definitely does have the makings of, you know, one of the best drivers to come out of this generation of Formula One drivers. But, you know, I think there's still a few things to nail and get right, which, you know, we saw with Max Verstappen as well. He was not that, he wasn't a consistent driver in that Red Bull until 2022, I would argue, maybe 2021.
Yeah, I mean, there's still bits of the puzzle to put together because these drivers, we have to remember that they are so young. You know, drivers were making their debut at ages that drivers have already won world championships nowadays. So with George, it's a really interesting one because he did have that really good run of top 5 finishes, 9 in a row, start last season. But obviously he had a bit of a dip after the summer break. Then he got that win. And, you know, on the face of it, it's a very good season. I think the real test is this year, especially if Mercedes get a car that doesn't act like a kangaroo and can actually do something on a regular basis. But we'll have to talk about Ferrari as well in this conversation, because let's not forget, for all of their kind of calamitous failings, and now that Binotto has been given the boot, well, whether he's been forced to give his resignation or they actually sacked him and then they just dressed it up in disguise, Fred Vasseur is now at the helm. And what I think we need to remember is that Ferrari had a car for almost every circuit in 2022. That car was fast everywhere. It wasn't necessarily reliable. But I don't think they were able to develop it as well as, say, Red Bull were able to develop the RB18 or Mercedes were able to develop their car. I think that is a significant difference in the Ferrari and Mercedes challenge to Red Bull. Now, Ferrari claimed to have solved the MGUH issues that they say were costing them 0.3 of a second a lap, which meant they were working the tyres harder and all of the knock-on effects. Where do you see Ferrari landing in 2023, Reeves?
Well, if the MGUH was costing them 0.3 seconds a lap, I can see Charles Leclerc, you know, nailing 2023's qualifying sessions. You know, when you look at how strong he was on one lap pace in 2022. But yeah, like you pointed out, Ferrari have gone through a bit of a change over the winter. Binotto is now Vasseur, and Fred Vasseur has proven that, you know, he can be at the helm of a lower midfield team, but a team that is ultimately punching above their weight, which is kind of what Ferrari as of late have been. But, you know, going to Ferrari, you know, you have the entire hopes and dreams of a nation, which is something you don't quite get with, you know, teams like Red Bull or Mercedes. But I do think, you know, we saw for all of their faults, a strong Ferrari unit, I would say, in 2022. You know, they've got 2 fantastic drivers in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, who are both still just getting better and better. But really, you know, it is a case of they need to solve what has been going wrong with their car. You know, when they were out in the lead by 30 seconds, it went bang. When they were very much in a fight with the other teams, they'd make a mistake on strategy. You know, there do need to be wholesale improvements in Ferrari, just to make themselves a championship winning team again.
Yeah, that's undeniable. And if they say they've got an extra 0.3 of a second out from solving the reliability problem, then that's going to go a long way. That could transform their strategic options. And it can be, we know this is a sport of fine margins. It can be something as small as, half of a second, and all of a sudden you've got, whatever that equates to over a stint distance, a race distance, that could give you a second extra to make a strategy work. And if you think back to Hungary, which might be perhaps the most glaring mistake that Ferrari made strategically in 2022, when they stuck the hard tires on to, roars of laughter by the end, that could be the difference. The fact that they were having to work the tires harder, they felt the need to go on to the harder compound to make a strategy work. Looking back now, it seems to make a little bit more sense. So perhaps Binotto being asked to resign is, it's kind of overkill. If you look at it in context, now perhaps Binotto was actually doing all the right things, and maybe they should have just been open and honest at the beginning, because if they had, people would have just gone, well, okay, you need to solve that, and they say, okay, we can't solve it till the end of the year. Okay, do the best you can, because that's the situation Mercedes were in. It was very obvious what the problem was. They were open about it. So perhaps, like you say, it's the weight of the nation. They can't be seen to be showing, what you call weakness in the public media. The Ferrari situation is very, very difficult. But like you say, they've got two excellent drivers, and Charles Leclerc is world champion material. And I remember doing the Grid Talk mid-season driver ratings with Tom Horrocks, and we had Ed Straw from the race, and he describes Charles as sort of flawed genius. And you can see that he's fantastically quick over a qualifying lap. And like you said, if he's going to nail qualifying this year even better than he did last year, he's going to walk away with every single pole position if the Ferrari is as good as it was in 22. But obviously, he actually lost a little bit to his teammate, Carlos Sainz, at the back end of last season. And there's been an interview go up on F1.com, and Carlos said that he reckons that Ferrari aren't far away from Red Bull. And here's what he had to say, and then I'll get your response to it, Ruby. I don't feel like we were far behind in terms of car development and car performance. If you think about it, I was on pole in Austin. We were 1-2 in quali. It must be that our car is actually not far from the Red Bull. Now, is Carlos just, trying to G up Ferrari ahead of the season? Or does he have a relevant point here? Is he hitting the nail on the head?
I'd say it's kind of a bit of both, really. You can't go into a new season when you've been well and truly beaten by a rival team. When you look at the fact that Max Verstappen was rivaling points with the Ferrari team itself, you can't go into a season like that, saying, oh yeah, this is going to be terrible, because that's what Ferrari were doing beforehand, and it also didn't work. The Austin race in particular, they were 1-2 in quali, and
then George Russell happened.
Then George Russell happened. He just turned in on him.
George took him out.
So they say. But by the point where Max had that bad pit stop and it put him behind Charles. They need to get more names for these drivers, honestly. But yeah, it put it behind Charles, and there was a fight for several laps going on. The new regulations do make it so the cars can fight a lot better. All we needed really was just cars that were able to compete with each other consistently and not finish 30 seconds behind one another. But then once Max actually got past Charles faded away, and ultimately I think Max made up something like 12 seconds in the space of a handful of laps, and broke a lot of Lewis Hamilton fans' hearts, and led Ted Kravitz to having one of the weirdest Twitter spats.
Good old
yeah,
Ted.
I do think there's a lot to be said by Carlos's points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think Carlos was on a really good trajectory second half of 22. Because if we remember back to start of last year, he was making errors, and the Ferrari was clearly the fastest car, and you know, it didn't really mean anything meaningful in the end because Verstappen ran away with it. But at that point, he was just literally throwing his championship chances into the gravel, because that's where he
Yeah.
ended up most of the time, down the drain. Um, Carlos he's a really interesting driver because he's not, well, he is fast, but he's not like super fast. He's not like got that Hakkinen, Senna, Leclerc, Hamilton, Verstappen raw pace. He's very methodical. He's very much like Alonso in that sense, just without the bad career choices so far. He really intrigues me because I feel like he could achieve so much, but the car almost has to be really, really perfect for him, almost like a Jenson Button style. Do you see a Carlos challenge for Leclerc in terms of supremacy within Ferrari this year? Could that be something that destabilizes them? And Fred Vasseur coming in is actually really important for Charles Leclerc, because remember, they were together, I think it was at ART when Leclerc was in GP2 or Formula 2. Can't remember when the name changed, but in the category ahead of, well, before F1. So that could be really, really interesting, and how Sainz's development comes through, and how Vasseur and Leclerc, not to say that Vasseur has been brought in just to manage Leclerc and make him the golden child, but that could create friction within Ferrari. I mean, how do you see their internal battle panning out?
Friction in Ferrari. I don't know what you're talking about, Aaron. I've never heard of that before in my life. But I think as well, I might be misremembering, but I think Vasseur was in charge of Sauber when Leclerc was there in 2018,
Yeah,
I think it was. So there is also that connection as well. But, like you were saying, we did see when they were in the Toro Rossos for that first season, I think back in 2014 or 2015, Carlos did seem to have the measure of Max in that car in equal performance, but it was sort of more Max was making mistakes. Carlos was in it for like the length of the race, and then ultimately when Max, would break down or crash or something like that, then Carlos came along and swept up the points that Max had cost himself. Which is kind of what we saw with Carlos at the end of this season, with Charles making so many mistakes. Carlos was still in the fight, and you look at Canada where Charles's car sort of stopped because Ferrari things. He was there fighting with Max for like the last 20 or so laps of the race, and fighting hard because at that point he still didn't have his debut win.
And that was a day that the Ferrari was faster, but because the Red Bull setup and the combination of that car with Max Verstappen at the wheel, just he had enough to hold Sainz off, and I think that was a really eye-opening performance from Sainz. That's what I hope to see almost every week. I know you won't get that in every race because we got 1,000 races in 2023, so you're going to have peaks and troughs everywhere for everyone. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how Sainz goes about Leclerc, because if they find themselves 1 and 2 and that's it for the win, that's going to be, especially early on in the season, if that's something that happens early doors, that's going to be a real marker for one against the other. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
And I know we mentioned him a little bit earlier. We're going to flip back to Mercedes, but Lewis Hamilton, where does he filter in all this? Is it just a given that he's going to arrive in a title battle if the Mercedes is good enough, or has 2022 left a little to be desired? I know he has been outscored by George, but there was the mitigating factors of he was having all the extreme setups, and Mercedes were doing all sorts with that. It's surprised he'd come out in as good physical condition as he did, because we saw him getting out in Baku and he looked like a crowd when he was getting out of it, to be honest. Where does Lewis filter in all this?
Well, it's Lewis Hamilton. You can never discount him. On his day, he is untouchable. With the exception of one driver out of the other 19. because that is very much touchable, those two cars. But I think Lewis no longer has, I think, the pressure of that long-standing record that he had of winning a race in every single season, getting a pole in every single season, because 2022 took that away from him. It's still a very long record. I think it might be the longest of those records, but
I think it's equal with Schumacher. If he'd
again.
done it last year, he would have broken it. So it's
Yeah.
another one that he shares with Schumacher, which, as a person who grew up absolutely detesting Ferrari and Schumacher and everything that they stood for, every record that Lewis can break of Schumacher's is just like a personal jig time for me, and cartwheels down the road, because it's bad memories of my childhood been banished, and then Max Verstappen's going to come along and just tear all of those up as well. So I agree with you. I think that the pressure of a win in every season actually might free Lewis up a little bit, because he just don't race. You're no longer the world champion. You're no longer the man with the target on your back. Go and be the underdog almost, which seems really weird to say about Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, going back to what you said, they were giving Lewis the very extreme setups to try and understand what was wrong with their car. If you're going to have a car, well, I say if you're going to have a car, like you plan to have a car like that. But if you're going to have a car which is, inconsistent, there's something clearly wrong with it. The driver you want to be testing that car in the strangest of setups is Lewis Hamilton. Not just because he's obviously been part of the team now for what will be 10 years now, but because he's a driver that, understands how the feel of the car changes the way the car works, how poor Mercedes kind of were in 2013. I say poor, they won races, but, that Mercedes, whatever it was, W03, was, or maybe W04.
W04.
Yeah, it was not, the race-winning, well-oiled team that we saw, by the end of 2018, for example. But yeah, I think, if you're gonna sacrifice a driver to try and learn some more about your misbehaving car, you do it with Lewis, because he's then also going to probably be able to bounce back, and he did, for the most part. We had, I think, an occasion where he finished 11th, and then some occasions where just like, he was still in the top 10, but quite far off his teammate, because his teammate had the more stable car. But, he still managed to wrestle it into that top 10. He's a driver you can't ever discount.
Exactly. You should never, ever discount Lewis Hamilton. So, Ruby, we've now discussed both teams who are the main contender. We assume will be the main contenders, McLaren or Alpine could produce something, or maybe even Haas or Williams could hit the jackpot. The FW14B comes out of retirement and, wipes the floor with everybody. But assuming it is Ferrari and Mercedes, and I know it's very early, it's the 5th of January today, it's very early to make predictions for this season, but which of those two teams, of Ferrari and Mercedes, wins more races? Now, bear in mind, in 2022, for all of Ferrari's extra performance, they only scored 4 victories. Mercedes should have scored more than their one, and they were in position to score several by the end of the season, but they only scooped that one. Which of those two teams wins more races? And crucially, how many?
Oh, I don't even know how many races we've got next season, but
potentially 24, because
wow.
China have been struck off. Now they've lifted their COVID restrictions, but I think there's a deal done with Portugal, which hasn't been announced yet. I've been seeing that fly around on Twitter. But then if China has lifted its COVID restrictions, theoretically they could go back on, because they have, you could say, it's a valid contract. I think we're at 24, potentially 24, definitely 23, which is still a lot, possibly 24. So yeah, how many of those do Ferrari or Mercedes win, if any?
Well, to answer the first question, which was who's going to win more, I think based on everything I've said in this episode so far, I kind of have to side with Mercedes winning it. And that's not just, from a personal bias perspective. Mercedes are a team that, winning is in their DNA. And, they have the strategies and they have two fantastic and one 7-time world champion, but two fantastic drivers. And then as well, when you consider James Allison, Bono, Toto Wolff, it's a team that should be at the front and deserves to be at the front. But ultimately, I think Mercedes will edge it in terms of race wins, provided, they have ultimately solved the issues with that no side pods concept, which they were saying throughout the entire season in the simulators and on paper was the fastest car by a significant margin. But then porpoising happened.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
if they can
say
fix that,
5 wins.
5 wins. Yeah, if they can fix that issue, and there was a whole load of different things that they had to do to the car to get it in that sort of working window to stop it bouncing around, so it didn't have the suspension travel. It was very stiff. You saw how it was over bumps. It was like, when you go down the road and you hit a pothole, in your road car, and it just bang, there's absolutely no give, and all the shock goes through your spine. I mean, that's what they were up against, but they weren't doing 20 miles an hour down, a horrible little road where your granny lives. They were doing it on a racetrack, and the car was doing it for fun. And it's interesting, it's really interesting that you mentioned the likes of James Allison and Toto Wolff, because and Peter Bonington as well, who is of course Lewis's engineer. That is really important. They are, of course, they've got all these championships under their belts, and you look at them, and there's always that air of calm, even over the radio. There's hardly ever any stress. If Peter Bonington went into another life, maybe he's a psychologist, because he just chills Lewis out. There's never any stress there, even if Lewis is absolutely like the house is on fire. So look at Ferrari. There's always a question, or what do you think about this? Let's do strategy. What the hell is that one? So for the Ferrari, which is the Mercedes people, does logically, you'd say, lead to, assuming the car is quick enough, them executing better races and winning more races. However, I have a bit of a feeling that Ferrari are still going to have performance this year, and it's going to be whether you can use that performance correctly, and that's going to decide whether they are able to win races this year. I think both teams will win races. I think we'll have multiple winners this year. I think we'll have a winner from the midfield as well. I think this is potentially the year that Alpine get a victory. Gasly or Ocon, and that's going to be a real statement for one of those two in that team. I'm going to go. My head goes with Mercedes. I think that's the logical choice. They were on the up. We don't quite know where Ferrari are. They've changed the team principle. Have they addressed issues that were plaguing their 2022 bid? Okay, they say they've solved the MGU8 problem, which is going to give them 3 seconds a lap. But if you're still putting the wrong tyres on the thing, it makes no difference, really. I mean, I'm going to go with Mercedes. It's going to look like Mercedes British bias. But I think if you look at all the facts, logically, I think Helmut Marko would agree with this as well. Mercedes are the bigger threat, and I think they're going to get 6 wins. And I think Lewis will get the majority of them. I think he'll comfortably outscore George on the win front this year, but George will definitely be up there. I think we're going to see multiple wins as well from the Ferrari boys as well. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll see any wins from Sergio Perez. I think that's kind of how the championship's going to shape up. I mean, not to turn this into a predictions episode, but that's kind of how I see it. That's the path I see this year taking. I mean, we were all wrong. Fernando Alonso, Aston Martin rock up and blitz the field, but things have happened.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Fernando Alonso has apparently been demanding that Aston Martin just plan a 4th engine for 2023. Which might be a bit of PTSD from Alpine and Honda, but if it does work as a strategy, just accounting for the whole whatever penalty it is these days with, so many different parts of the power unit, accounting for that and knowing where to take an engine penalty, that could have a big difference. And you never know. Alpine World Champions 2023, I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, the engine penalty thing is quite interesting because with Max Verstappen last year, they took the penalty in Belgium and he still won the race. So, knowing where to take your engine penalties is really, really important. That brings us to the end of the show. Now, let us know with a comment below in the comment section, obviously, or if you're listening on podcast, on audio, send a tweet to me at AHGP All the links will be in the show notes. Leave a comment down below and answer the question that we've just answered ourselves. How many wins who wins the most races out of Mercedes and Ferrari, and how many do they get in 2023? Ruby, thank you very, very much for joining me this evening. Where can we find more from you? Where can we find you on social media?
Yes, actually.
Cesspool that is.
The absolute cesspool that is social media. On Twitter, I'm at Rubes, RUUBEZ. On Instagram, Rubes001. But if you want to find me on YouTube, where I'm hoping that in 2023 I'll be a lot more active than I was last year, it's at Ruby Price.
Excellent. So go and check out Ruby, check out the Grid Talk podcast, check out F1 Chronicle. All that stuff is very, very good. We'll have loads of shows for you. We've got previews, race reviews, qualifying reviews. We've got interviews with various guests. We've had banners from Missed Apex. He was on with Tom Horrocks last year, and Michael Laminato from Box of Neutrals. I think we had a couple of other guests on as well. George has interviewed a few people on there too. You can find more from me at AHGP Pod. My personal Twitter is Aaron Harper 41. I am AHGP on Instagram and Aaron Harper 22 on Instagram. Again, everything will be in the show notes down below. So the checkered flag is waving on this episode. Leave a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the show. Subscribe for more Grand Prix content. And thank you very much for watching or listening.